a chance to mingle with one another and reflect on this morning's three fantastic panel discussions. We've got another hour of discussions and speakers for you coming up now. So it'll be the same format. We'll bring the panelists on, and then there'll be three different presentations for them all to discuss. So let's welcome the panel to the stage. We have Svante Axelsson, National Coordinator for Fossil-Free Sweden, which is a Swedish government initiative to increase the pace of climate transition here. We also have Dr. Cecilia Hermansson, a researcher at KTH University here in Stockholm and Vice Chairman of the Swedish Climate Policy Council. Sigbrit Karlsson, just coming down now, is the rector at KTH University. And we're also joined by Magnus Ek, a Member of Parliament for the Centre Party here in Sweden. So welcome to the stage. And our first speaker for this session is here with a presentation called Double Dividend, Transnational Initiatives and Government Innovation for Climate Change and Biodiversity. Please welcome Harriet Bulkley, who is Professor in Geography and Sustainability from Durham University. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Hi everyone. Hi everyone, and thanks very much for having me today. It's a real pleasure to be with you. So I know that we've been talking about climate change, but for some of you it will not be a surprise to know that climate change is not the only game in town. And how we play this game, the climate change game, the rules of that game have significant implications for other key issues. And particularly today I want to draw our attention to the ways in which the climate change agenda and the biodiversity agenda are becoming increasingly coupled. So what I'm kind of starting to ask myself is this question about whether we can actually achieve on the ground a double dividend for both climate and biodiversity through the kinds of policies that we're implementing at the moment. And this is work done with my colleagues who gave me permission to say that it was all their fault if I make any mistakes. So off we go. So one of the key things about this growing bringing together of the climate and biodiversity agendas is it's not really happening in the international policy arena, and it's only partly happening at the national government level. Now, many people have been giving credit to Sweden for various different things this morning, and I am not going to be the only one not to do so. And so I do note that in the Swedish context, the Research Council Formas has led a new initiative to have a research program on climate and biodiversity, and it is the only one that I know that is taking place in European countries at the moment. And they have been overwhelmed with applications, I know, because I'm going to be the chair of the committee, but there are 150 applications for this call. To do research on how climate and biodiversity agendas should be brought together. So we know that it's a really live topic, and it's a really live topic here in Sweden as well. But what we understand by looking at what's happening in practice is that this boundary between climate and biodiversity is really being shaped by non-state actors. So by municipalities, they are part of the state, but in our academic language we call them non-state, which for city councils, we're sorry, that's just how it works. So city councils, the regional governments, but also private companies, non-governmental organizations, philanthropists, financiers, and the rest. And this is happening through these things which we call transnational governance initiatives that bring together this mix of these actors across different national boundaries and are increasingly looking at the climate and biodiversity problems together. Now, we know that these transnational governance initiatives are becoming increasingly formalized as part of international policy. The United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change now makes special provision to count their actions and their targets in this race to zero that they have within the United Nations Framework Convention. And they also are trying to do the same within the Biodiversity Convention. So it's not that the international organizations are absent, it's just that they are relying on the non-state actors to bring these agendas together. And here, so we found some evidence of this new frontier being generated as climate initiatives move into the biodiversity agenda, as conservation organizations seek to focus the biodiversity, to focus attention on biodiversity by making it related to climate, and as a specific set of initiatives look at nature-based solutions. I think in Sweden it's more often called green infrastructure, as an umbrella term used to bring together all sorts of different ways in which we can work with nature on the ground to deliver multiple benefits. So just to show you a little bit about what's happening, the IUCN, this is their kind of logo about nature-based solutions, and what we see is that there's a new then architecture of governing climate change, which is linking it specifically to biodiversity. It's being driven by all sorts of reasons. We can take this up maybe in the panel, but specifically the idea of getting to net zero is driving this focus on nature-based solutions as a potential sink for the remaining carbon emissions that cannot be addressed through technology. And that's having specific effects in the nature-based solutions world and on biodiversity. So just in terms of what kinds of things we can see and think about in terms of nature-based solutions, governing with nature for climate change has, of course, been common in the past through RED programs, which are focused on forests. But we now see a whole set of new ecologies and spaces, sites, including cities where I mostly do my work, being, if you like, enrolled as places in which nature can be used to govern climate change, both for mitigation and for adaptation. But in practice, then, what are the chances that this double dividend will be realized? What are the chances that we can work with nature-based solutions on the ground to realize nature-based solutions? And a lot of it depends, to come back to the theme of today, on the forms of innovation and climate finance that are being generated and realized around nature-based solutions. So the first thing that we can see, and it's all really to do with can we stabilize nature-based solutions over the long term? We've heard a lot about the need for long-term, stable policy, long-term, stable initiatives that investors can get behind, that companies can rely on, and that governments can set the direction for, and also know are going to deliver to their long-term targets. So we see increasing focus on trying to stabilize nature-based solutions as an asset around which these services of carbon mitigation, resilience, potentially water cleaning, air cleaning, well-being for health and for society can be realized over the long term. We see financialization playing a very strong role here, accompanied by new forms of innovation with technology. There's an awful lot going on with drones. I know very little about drones, but I know that they matter. Lots of remote sensing technologies also being used. And this sphere of innovation is very exciting on the one hand, but on the other hand, we also have to ask ourselves, how is that nature becoming known? So what properties of nature are coming to be known and valued? And who is owning that data? And what kind of public access is there to that data? So there are some really interesting things happening, lots of potential scope for innovation, but at the same time, potential for key interests that are most concerned to mitigate the last part of the sort of net zero pile without perhaps paying so much attention to the biodiversity challenge itself. Increasingly, Indigenous people and local communities, sorry for the acronym here, are also being enrolled as important stewards to take care of nature over the long term. But there's more limited evidence of how far that taking care of nature is to deliver benefits for them, or is it to deliver benefits for those investors and those companies and those other organizations that are looking for nature-based solutions to contribute to their net zero targets. What we're concerned about really here is that the complex benefits that nature-based solutions can provide that are maybe more temporarily, so over time they change, they're spatially a bit disaggregated, they're hard to get hold of, but they can be very beneficial, particularly around health, well-being, economic development, water retention, adaptation, sustainable drainage, and all sorts of other things are getting neglected, which may mean the financing and the innovation for nature-based solutions goes in particular directions and we leave out the rest. So we think there is real potential for double dividends here, but it's going to take, if you like, responsible innovation and responsible financing to realize those. I'll leave it there, and I look forward to discussing with the panel.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.
Do you want to take a seat at the end? I think that's most logical, and I'll move up here so it doesn't look like I don't want to be near any of you guys. I think, should we start with Svante from Fossil Free Sweden? Do you want to just explain a little bit about what Fossil Free Sweden does here in Sweden, and just pick up on some of Harriet's points there?
Yes. Fossil Free Sweden is a national and governmental initiative to promote the transition of the Swedish economy to be total fossil free. And we have produced now, together with the sectors, industrial sectors, 22 roadmaps, voluntary, bottom-up process. Mm-hmm. And we have a new language, you can say, in Sweden, that we say we will want to step up and do it faster because it's good for the welfare, for the job and the growth. And it's not me, as said, this is the leaders of different companies and sectors. So the politicians are in hurry because they have to deliver to reduce obstacles for this new logic, because we believe that Sweden will become a better country for all people if we are fossil free earlier. So that was a starting point. That's a good story. The other one is how we can combine these different tool challenges, you can say. And what I catch up, it was, I think, very easy in the urbans, in the cities, because there we have, in the future, less cars, more mobility systems, and less parking places, and more green areas, better air, less noise, and so on, more electric solutions. We need the cars in Dalsland and Bengtsfors and all that, but not in Stockholm, Gothenburg, and Malmö so far. And we see the cities which are very popular to live in is cities where we reduce the amount of cars. And I mean, Volvo have new business strategies to not sell only cars, they will sell mobility. So I think that the combination of modern production of mobility and Build Sweden have changed the world to Mobility Sweden. It's a sign in this time. The second reflection I have is, I mean, biodiversity is a common good. And in agriculture sector, we pay for that. Ecosystem payment is not so developed, but we have small part of it. And I think we can have more focus to really pay for this common good as an ecological system service. So that's a good combination. In the forests, I think we need to also discuss that even if we take out more materials from the forest, I think we can increase the production of biodiversity. And it depends, we need to develop the forest management. We have lot of things to do. So you can damage the forest very fast if you do it in the wrong way, and you can produce it very sustainable in another way. So I think we all believe that we need more services and resources from the forest in Sweden, but we also can handle this to produce more, and also that the consumer, I mean, the German newspapers want to pay for the value of the forest in Sweden. It's a very little cost to buy a newspaper if they take more responsibility for biodiversity. We know that we can sell 25% more expensive steel because it's a little cost for the person who buy a car. It's the same when you buy furniture or buy a newspaper. You can pay the owner of the forest what we want them to do.
Thank you. Let's get Martin to pick up. Martin, you represent the Centre Parties, centre-right party here in Sweden with its roots in the countryside, really. So what's your take? Do you think there's enough joined-up thinking at the moment?
I should begin to say that it's not Martin anymore, it's Magnus.
Sorry.
You're respecting Martin, got me.
I did introduce you correctly, but I've still got Martin in my questions section. Sorry, Magnus.
It's fine. I would be fine with being Martin as well. Could you repeat the question, please?
Magnus is still from the Centre Party, which has its roots in the countryside, centre-right party here in Sweden. And I just wanted to get your take on what Harriet said, and whether you think there's enough cooperation and joined-up thinking, which is something that I took as a kind of key point from her presentation.
I absolutely don't think there's enough cooperation and joined-up thinking, and I think it's very interesting, just as you did, to look at, we have different landscapes, and nature-based solutions looks different within these different landscapes. So, for example, in our urban areas, we will have, precisely as Svante said, in some sectors, the road to sustainability and this transition is easier, for example, with transport. In other sectors, for example, heating, I think actually that the countryside has the advantage. And when it comes to biodiversity, that's absolutely the case. I think, if I might describe it as the battle for biodiversity is won and lost within the agricultural and rural landscape. But the cities has an important role to play in really doing what they can, not becoming more, grey deserts. I'm become very negative towards urban areas, please don't get me wrong. But more of, green cityscapes and trying to evolve cities and build cities where we, more than today, provide these ecological services within the urban landscapes as well. But I think if we are to achieve that, we need more joined-up thinking, for example, within academia, for example, between those who have the experience of building these solutions, often in rural areas, often in agricultural sectors or close to the agricultural sectors, coming into the urban areas. And this is what we see, actually, in Swedish universities. For example, the University for Agriculture in Sweden. The people that I started studying with there are extremely interested in this, and they're kind of instinctively seeing, okay, so where is our role, and what is our role over the coming decades? And they're already joining up to win that battle for biodiversity and managing this transition. But I think we're still just in the opening phases of that process.
Thank you. Sigbrit, would you like to pick up? We've heard a bit about livable cities. Well-being was also mentioned in the presentation as something to consider on one of those slides. You're a rector. What's your take on what we've heard so far?
I would like to start to say that it's really interesting to see the biodiversity and climate change. I don't think there is enough links between those areas. In fact, we need much more. And if we talk about biodiversity, we have already manipulated nature, I would say, in the forest industry, because we have a majority of one kind of trees that grows in order to have forestry products. And the same is with agricultural crops. And if we don't take care about the biodiversity in a general way, I think we will lose the struggle, because as the heat is increasing, things are happening. If I take Sweden, we will have another kind of biodiversity in Sweden where certain species will vanish and others will invade. And health issues is really important with respect to that. KTH is the largest technical university in Sweden, and we train engineers. A lot of our students are increasingly interested in the area of sustainable development. And we train the engineers in various aspects. And of course, I think we need to train them even more. But still, that's a really important role for us to have that. And biodiversity into that context is maybe not as present as it could be, I would say.
Yeah. Thank you. Dr. Cecilia Hermansson. I think it was up. Yeah.
Yes. Yes, thank you for a very interesting presentation. From my perspective, I'm at KTH, but I'm also the vice chair of the Climate Policy Council, evaluating if we are doing all right, if the government is doing all right when it comes to achieving net zero in 2045. And I think that the focus is, of course, on climate change, the transition. We don't have much time, but we need much more to look at the biodiversity as well. So I really welcome your paper here and your presentation. I think that in many respects it will go hand in hand, but there are also cases when there will be conflicts of goals, conflicts of interests, and I think it's very important to be transparent about those. And also, since we know that we need to work together in order to achieve climate change, we also need to prioritize and focus to do what is the best thing at every possible situation. And let's take an example now with green steel, which is a very important achievement, actually changing the whole of the northern Sweden, building new parts of cities, expanding on housing and jobs, and it's really a huge development. And I assume that building grid motorways will have a big impact on those regions, and it will affect also biodiversity and also how people are achieving or receiving these developments. So in this case, I think we must be very careful how we use energy and how we use, for example, mining. Taking the example of having lots of energy going to Bitcoin production or Facebook or others, when we actually will need the energy for steel production instead, is one example. Another example is opening up a mine in Kallak, which is for iron ore, which I think we have pretty much of already. So here is an issue of prioritizing, because that's an issue of biodiversity as well, and also for the cultures up there. Really think this through very carefully before doing it, and maybe focusing more on the minerals that we need for battery production instead. So this is all about conflicts and also about prioritization, as I see it.
Yeah, that has been a controversial issue. The government has said it has consulted, and it is something that took a long time to come to fruition, just to give the other side of the story there. Does anyone in the audience have any burning questions for Harriet? It would be great to get a couple of audience perspectives on biodiversity. If not, I'd just like to pick up a bit more. I mentioned the well-being side of things a little bit earlier, but our environments and how we live has become so much sort of to the fore of conversation since COVID. And I was just wondering whether that's something that has sort of lifted your work or prompted more conversations in a different way. People want to protect the nature and the green spaces because they've spent a bit more time in them.
Yeah, I mean, I think it also reflects a little bit on some of the comments that the panel have made as well, that in some ways, the most obvious place for nature-based solutions is in cities, because that's where we concentrate people. It's where they can deliver on health and well-being. We certainly see the value of nature in terms of health and well-being being increasingly considered. You can see that, say, regimes for planting in parks and gardens everywhere are starting to think about therapeutic gardening, about creating space for mental health, as well as just sort of traditional gardens. So you can see that this kind of change of thinking about the health and well-being aspect is coming through. And nature-based solutions in cities can also help protect assets from flood damage and all sorts of other things. On the other hand, they're very difficult to finance. They're usually public finance. They are, in some sense, a public good in cities, but whether the public purse can stretch to cover them is a big question. And in a sense, the ways in which at this transnational level and all the actors who are involved are focusing very strongly on the climate mitigation aspect of nature-based solutions may mean that kind of carbon content of nature is what becomes valued. And that has then implications about not really being able to deliver nature-based solutions which really can then address health and mental well-being, or water resilience and so on, as I was saying earlier. So I think that's one key dilemma that we're facing, that maybe where the most valuable nature-based solutions will be is the place that we can least afford to pay for them. And at the same time, nature-based solutions that can address climate change may, especially on the mitigation side, may start to have these unintended consequences. So that rather than having like a monocrop that is structured by the value of the wood, you start instead to get monoplantations structured by the value of the carbon that they can contain. And similar kind of mono practices for agriculture. So these unintended consequences and how we deal with the trade-offs that are emerging, it is a very complicated area.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping at least that once Formas has funded some more research in this area, Sweden at least will know what it's doing in this regard.
Thank you. I'd love to continue the discussion, but we're already a little bit over time. So let's put our hands together for Professor Harriet Buckley. Thank you so much. Okay, next up we're talking about ambient air pollution and the future role of policymakers. So please welcome Avi Ebenstein, who's Associate Professor at the Department of Environmental Economics and Management at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you very much. So we're going to shift our minds a little bit to a little bit east on the map. So this paper is more about not what is driving climate change, but some of the consequences. So I'm looking at the Indian context, and for those who don't know, India is very polluted. I wish I would have thought about it before I put a line over here of Swedish pollution all the way down here. So we're thinking about the climate change and the environment, but the air pollution issues in developing countries are really severe. So this is the Indus-Gangetic Plain. For those of you who don't know that, I'm going to show you a map in a second. But you see that the blue line, it's really polluted in the IGP, and that is home to 19 of the 20 most polluted cities in the world, okay? So that's an important thing to know. It's also worth noting that you see the seasonality. So in these dry months in December, January, where it's cold and the weather lends itself to pollution, you see these huge spikes, which are really dangerous. here's a quick map. This is the region of the Indus River and the Ganges River where they, this basin, this airshed, if you will, which gets very polluted. So this project, my question when I approached this was, what is going to be the impact of climate change on pollution and health, right? So insofar as pollution levels, ambient pollution levels, not just about emissions, it's also about the weather. How much is this going to change, okay? So to do that empirically, you want to look at a few things. So one is, how much does weather affect pollution? How tightly are those linked, okay? Because that's going to tell us something about how we should think about regulations. And so I got thinking about this, and once you realize that the weather has a huge impact on pollution, you start realizing that the right rules on firms or individuals who are polluting should be some function of the damage they're doing. So it's not that the damage is the same everywhere. There should be some sort of mechanism by which we can transfer the information to people that the thing we're really worried about is the damage from pollution. And climate change makes it gives us a window into how things are going to look, okay? So I'm going to show you a few results here. The first thing I want you to understand empirically is that the regional differences in India are really large and important. So you see this big positive number of 16 micrograms, which is the IGP, this region in India, it's always more polluted. And you see that that's controlling for all the weather or whatever's going on. This is a region where we have to be thoughtful about the regulations. They should be tougher than other parts of the country, okay? That's the first thing to take away. The second thing is that the daily weather matters. So daily and monthly weather patterns, you see that the more extreme patterns, these measures, heating degrees, is how inclement the weather is, how extreme it is. And you also see precipitation, which is driving down pollution. And a lot of those things are going to get worse with climate change. There's going to be more extreme weather, more rainfall in the rainy season when you don't need it so much, and less in some of the parts of the year where it would really clear things up. So once you understand that the pollution any given day is a function of the weather, that makes you have this thought experiment. What's going to happen when you have climate change? So what I do is I fit this model of what the weather is going to look like, okay, and I take the data for which we have weather and fit this model and then project that onto the future weather and say, what would that do to pollution? So that thought experiment yields this estimate of 10.2 microgram increase in pollution, okay? And that's a big deal. So based on estimates from my work with some other colleagues in China, we estimate that's about that would result in about a year lost life expectancy from birth for long-term exposure. And that's a big number. And when you take that and couple that with the fact that 1.2 billion people live in India and 800 million people live in the IGP, that means the stakes are really high. So this whole climate change story, we've talked a lot about the drivers of it. This is kind of getting into the consequences of climate change. And then there's a so what here. So I'm going to show you that on the last slide, which is my conclusion slide, which is that weather and pollution are intimately linked. That's something that's worth thinking about. And we know there are going to be problems on the horizon. So I was using a relatively benign scenario for future weather, and you already see that there's this big increase in pollution. That's worth thinking about. And so the implications of this, from a policy perspective, is one is you can think about this just having the information. We know where there's going to be pollution. We know where it's going to get worse, and that's worth knowing. And the second thing is this kind of a deeper point is it makes sense for firms and other polluters to say, hey, these are the rules. We're going to punish you based on the outcomes. We see this coming. Where do you want to locate your factory? Some sort of balance where firms would have to make some trade-offs of where they can access workers and where they can do less harm to the environment. So that joint decision is kind of a dialogue I think that policy should have, where we have some sort of alignment between the cost of pollution and what the firms or the polluters are paying. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Avi Ebenstein. Take a seat. Good to be reminded of some of the tangible impacts of climate change, which we've been talking about in quite an abstract sense throughout this morning. Svante, can I start with some responses from you? I mean, obviously the weather very different in Sweden to in India, but some takeaways from you from that presentation.
Yes, thank you for the presentation. It's very interesting issue, and what I really will start with is to see the co-benefits between air pollution strategies and the climate strategies. It has been very successful. I mean, we have reduced the emissions of acid pollutions in Sweden and EU in a very successful way. We have get more crops, more the agriculture sector will deliver more production, and the health is much better. And then we have taken step by step. We talk about NOx and particles and other things. So I mean, we can reduce the emissions of climate gases very, very cheap if we have a very strong regulation on other type of emissions. So I mean, that is a very, very strong example of how we can co-benefit the strategies and the regulations, how we can get very good results. Because if we just focus on pollutions that have a damage on the health, we can solve a lot of other problems. So I mean, we have regulations on cars, we have regulations on factories and so on. So I mean, if we look back, this is a successful field in Sweden and EU.
Thank you. Cecilia?
Yes, I agree. Thank you for a very interesting presentation. I think what you are looking at here, and the weather is so important also when it comes to climate change. And we talk a lot about the transition, but we also have the adaptation and how to work out when this is really happening. And so the weather consequences are huge. We can also bring it on to other policy issues on insurances and financing of, and like Svante is saying, we can really fix this with regulations. And I think in the perspective of other countries also, that national regulations are very important and to be very focused to get results. So I think this is very important work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you. Martin, what's your political, Magnus, sorry, what is your, I got it right, what's your political take on all of this?
It's fine.
Same party, yeah.
Same person.
Same party, same person. Basically, we're interchangeable. You know, I get a ton of takeaways and thoughts spinning in my head. But if I try to pick up a few things and also connecting it to the prior discussion we had with, you know, there are also very good examples for us. For example, opening mines, ramping up production in Sweden and Europe, not just exporting this. That's one takeaway I think we should have, because right now we're also exporting pollution, not just air pollution, but pollution of water resources, pollution of ground resources. I think the process we're having within the European Union now, trying to get a better framework for due diligence, is something that would also affect this. But I don't think that we should forget the developmental aid and cooperation side of this. I mean, if you look, and correct me if I'm wrong, but if you're looking at India specifically and the GDP, IGP, not GDP, for God's sake. It's a very complex problem. It's not just about cities and cityscapes. It's also about agricultural practices, for example, crop burning. And we've moved away from similar harmful practices in Europe and in Sweden. And I think there's really an opportunity to spread best practice, both technology and regulation. And I'm not saying that we should come and tell people in North India how they should live their lives, how they should build this society. But there is an opportunity with developing countries, for example, India, of spreading these best practices. And I think that this is something where we also just started to really get this going. And if I might get just slightly into the Swedish developmental aid work, this is something where we really see potential interconnecting between state actors and private actors. And when we're looking at example projects for electrification in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, we have projects that we scale up the state investment by a factor of 10, 20 or more. So there are opportunities for also scaling up financing for these kind of projects. And I think that all of these things, spreading best practice, getting better regulation, and accelerating financing is something where we should focus politically over the coming decades.
Thank you. Sigbritt?
Thank you very much for interesting presentation, because India is really a good example of what you already said, that we can work much more internationally and spread good examples, because the way they burn crops by the end of the season increases the air pollution. And the other thing with Asia is also the lack of waste management, systematic waste management, which means that my area is polymer technology, plastics, and plastics in oceans. A large amount of the plastics that travels around in the oceans come from Asia, because they just throw away the waste in the rivers. So we need much more to work together on that, and also to understand what is air pollution. How do in Sweden we have already regulated. You are not allowed to just throw things in the air, if I say it like that. And it was a long time ago that it was regulated, and you pay if you are releasing things to the air. But that needs to be similar all over the world, in fact, because otherwise we will have a very clean environment here in Sweden and in Scandinavia, and we will be very happy about that. But large part of the world and the people around the world will not have a clean air and reduce lifetime expectancy.
What's your reflection on that, Abby? I mean, we've heard so much, Sweden's a role model, Sweden's a beacon, but it's a country at the end of the day of 10 million people in the far north, and there are these huge industrial players, India, China, so it is really important to put this into context, isn't it?
Totally. I think it's really interesting. So there's an old idea in environmental economics of an environmental Kuznets curve, which was an old idea that countries that are really poor are not polluted, and countries that are really rich are not polluted. And in between, as you industrialize, you get polluted, and it's worth it for you. And I always, kind of put China and India as middle countries. Some parts of Africa are in that first category, and then I think of Scandinavia as the other side of the environmental Kuznets curve. And that's great here. And actually, I think the moral imperative that Swedes feel, that I feel in this room, is kind of awesome to see, and there's a lot to be proud of. And there's the other side of it, which is that if you think about emissions, okay, the scale of it, it's like, we got Swedish emissions down. And the scale of India and China, maybe it doesn't matter as much. And then this in-between thing, which was what my paper's getting into, is along the way, what are the right rules for those developing countries? Because in terms of the human health cost, that might be the bigger stakes thing. But I think that you guys are bringing up some neat points. I mean, technology that's invented here can be used everywhere. Like, I feel like some marriage of Western dollars and ideas with developing country practices could lead to like a better equilibrium for everybody. And I think getting these ideas started is a good place.
Yeah, and playing devil's advocate, Swedes are very high consumers. People do buy and use a lot of products from China, from India, that are imported here. And we heard a little bit earlier about trying to encourage consumers to adapt their habits as well. Did you want to pick up on that?
If I could.
Yeah, we've got 1 more minute.
because you're completely right. I mean, these are linked, and I think that I'm also very proud of the moral imperative that I feel that majority of Swedish society has, and I think we need to use that moral imperative if we can. Not getting into Swedish exceptionalism, but a lot of this isn't about cutting edge technology. It isn't about rocket science. It's about getting a functioning system for handling waste and providing water and fuel, and heating houses. These are the simple things that we cracked during the 20th century in Sweden. And the problem we have right now is trying to get our own environmental impact down at the same time that we're trying to help the rest of the world get their impact down, but also just building a better everyday society for people living in India or sub-Saharan Africa or Norway even.
I hear your emotion coming out.
But it's not rocket science. It's just about implementing the same ideas that we've already had. And this goes for agriculture as well. This goes for pretty much whatever we want to look at. It's just about implementing sound practices. And sorry if I'm sounding like a very boring Swedish politician.
I think your fire is why you got elected. I think it's great to see it.
They're not in power.
The last thing I would say is just that, but it gets into this kind of complicated moral question. When you think of the environmental Kuznets curve of what's right for India and what's right for Sweden might be different things. And how do we kind of embrace that reality, but also realize there's one planet. So like, you want to acknowledge that other people have different needs and different trade-offs, but we still need to, there's just this one planet we're all sharing. And so that balancing act is something that we're kind of navigating,
Yeah, but I had an Indonesian delegation a couple of weeks back, and what do they want to talk about when they came to Sweden? Managing plastic waste. And from the perspective that, okay, you guys are good, but you're 10 million. We're more than 10 million in Indonesia. We've gotten some of the way, and we're kind of thinking we don't want to copy you. We just want to hear, okay, so what good ideas do you have that would work in Indonesia? And I think that the Indonesian policymakers are perfectly capable of seeing what can we implement, what do we want to implement, and what don't we want to implement.
Really positive to hear that those discussions are taking place. We'll wrap it up there. Thank you very much to Avi Ebenstein from the University of the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. Thank you. All right, last but definitely not least, we are going to hear from Michael A. Mellon. He's the Deputy Director of the Centre for Energy and Environmental Policy Research at the Massachusetts Institutes of Technology, MIT, of course, and a Professor of Professor of Practice at the University of Strathclyde Law School. I hope I got that all right. Looking forward to your final presentation.
Thank you, Maddie, and thanks for having me here. In fact, I was just thinking, it's 28 years ago, a first semester law student came after finishing the first semester, very broad general law, and was really excited to come to Stockholm to get the first exposure to environmental law. That was me and my start, if you like, into thinking about environmental law and policy. And so I'm grateful because it was here that I kind of, a journey began that ultimately resulted in thinking about these topics. And I think with this presentation, we pick up some of the themes that had already been resonating in the previous session. Some countries like Sweden are proving very successful at reducing their own domestic emissions, but there is still consumption of goods produced in countries with high emissions, including air pollution and other pollutants, to service demand for those consumer goods here in Sweden. So trade in goods, in services, in capital, in ideas has been part of human history. And even though we currently see sort of a bit of a retrenchment in thinking about globalization, further trade liberalization, it will remain a reality, a fact of human life, if you like. And that has implications for climate change. And just one way of visualizing that is thinking about the emissions, the carbon emissions, greenhouse gas emissions, that are embodied, if you like, in goods that travel across national borders. So this map essentially shows whether countries are net importers or exporters of carbon in goods. In one way, let's look at Sweden, for instance. If you take the whole Swedish carbon footprint, Sweden actually, if you consider the carbon embodied in goods that Swedish consumers import from other countries like China, Swedish emissions would actually be 60% higher than its own territorial emissions. The emissions that it accounts for under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, the emissions that, it says, these are the Swedish emissions. But if you think about these carbon emissions embodied in goods, it's actually quite a bit higher. But Sweden's not the worst. Switzerland actually, it's more than 100% of their territorial emissions. A small country, small island state like Singapore, it's almost 3 times as many emissions are embodied in goods. So they're really their consumption is responsible for emissions elsewhere that are quite significant. These transfers are by no means due to climate policy, at least not yet, It's very, very marginal effect. It's other factors. It's, division of labor, trade balance, it's production costs, et cetera, cheaper labor, more carbon-intensive electricity grids, et cetera, in other parts. Those are the main factors. But there is concern that as at least some countries really start accelerating their climate policy and their targets, the net zero emissions targets, their short-term and medium-term policies and measures, that could start sort of exacerbating this. And it's, of course, not only an environmental problem. What does it help if Sweden has reduced its territorial emissions to 0, but still is importing very carbon-intensive goods from other countries that are not successfully reducing their emissions? It's an environmental problem. Even more so, you could argue, it's a political problem, because you see production offshoring, you see capital offshoring, you see fuel use offshoring, you see jobs offshoring. So it's also something that is very fundamental for the acceptance of continued acceleration of climate policy ambition. So far, one reason why it's not been due to climate policy is that we've been very effective in sort of dampening, weakening the climate policy signals, let's say the carbon price or the carbon cost faced by domestic industries. In Sweden and other parts of the EU, for instance, under the EU ETS, it's been free allocation. It's been indirect carbon cost compensation for the indirect costs of, carbon through electricity prices, et cetera. So there's been ways to sort of protect our industries, but we know that we cannot uphold that if we want to reach net zero emissions. And so there's been this discussion, so how do we replace that? And one way of thinking, or one way of doing that, and it's been mentioned in the previous panel, is the carbon border adjustment mechanism. So this is an instrument essentially to make sure that any imported goods face the same carbon price as domestic producers face when these products are produced domestically, so that you level the playing field, you prevent some of these economic things, the competitiveness issues with a non-level playing field, but also that you start preventing just sort of solving your domestic climate problem with imports of carbon-intensive goods from other parts of the world. The problem is that these types of instruments, like the CBAM, they're legally risky, they're politically controversial, and they're technically very complex. But we've discussed this, we understand that these risks are there, and the European Union and sort of the voters have essentially made a pact and said, the risk is worth it. We need this. It is a key part of our continued journey towards decarbonization. We're willing to embrace that. But it's a gamble because we do not have much empirical evidence on how these border carbon adjustment measures and other types of sort of similar measures taken unilaterally or by a collective like the EU at their borders will actually work. And there's not much empirical evidence. And I'll only focus on the opportunities for circumvention as one example of how complex these are and how we may be underestimating the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities of these kinds of instruments. So again, there's not much empirical evidence, but one example that the European Non-Ferrous Metals Trade Association, Eurometaux, keeps mentioning as well, if we have a CBAM that includes Scope 2 emissions from electricity, China, average carbon-intensive aluminum is about 3 times as high as European carbon intensity of aluminum production. But there's one province in China that gets all its electricity from hydropower, so Yunnan province. And there's enough aluminum production in that one province that they could easily meet all their current export flows to the EU just from that province. Nothing would change in terms of carbon emissions. They would avoid the CBAM by switching from their carbon-intensive aluminum to the low-carbon aluminum and just export that to the EU. Again, we don't have much empirical evidence because there's not been use of border carbon adjustments around the world, except one place, California. The state of California imposes a BCA, a border carbon adjustment, on electricity imports from neighboring states. Interestingly, the evidence, the experience there, both in the research and the scholarship, but also in the empirical track record, is this is a very, very untractable problem to solve, very difficult. There has been resource shuffling almost for sure. Some analytical research suggests it's actually undone a lot of the benefits of the Californian ETS. So again, we don't really know how this is going to pan out when implementing the CBAM. Similar things with, for instance, transshipment. Some countries are exempt from the CBAM, countries that have a linked ETS. The UK, which has an ETS, will probably link it to the EU ETS, so it will be exempt from paying the CBAM. Unless it has its own CBAM, which is very similar to the EU's, you could imagine, say, aluminum from Mozambique entering the UK market, and it's not even that aluminum that would continue on to the EU exempt from the CBAM. No, it would just meet demand in the UK so that clean UK aluminum can enter the European market. So there's all these sort of flows and ways of kind of avoiding having to pay the CBAM that could potentially materialize. And I think our experience, our observations with other types of sanctions, financial sanctions, et cetera, even now currently, shows us that there's a lot of leakiness to the system. I won't go through the other ones. I just want to sort of say there are solutions to this, but they come at a cost. For instance, you can just apply a blanket CBAM, which is not what the European Commission has proposed, to avoid these opportunities to shift, but then you lose a lot of the economic efficiency and the environmental benefits, and you incur new legal risks. Think of it, if you like, this way. There's a pandemic, and countries can try to sort of lock off their borders, but we've seen that this is a leaky approach. There will always be some ways in which pathogens do enter your territory. The only sort of real durable solution is to make sure that everybody has vaccines. And that's kind of what I'm proposing is we have been thinking a lot about how we can implement these unilateral border adjustments and other ways of sort of protecting our economy within our borders. What we really need to do is ensure that around the world, all countries have access to competitive, cost parity, if you like, low-carbon technologies. We have to scale up these technologies. We have to make them commercially viable. We have to make them economically viable. And this is really, in my view, the only durable and permanent solution to this otherwise, this whack-a-mole of you hit emissions down in one place, but you see them pop up elsewhere. Cooperation can help on this, but unfortunately right now I think the focus on between countries thinking about what can we do about leakage, what can we do about these spillovers, has been very much on the sort of punitive side. Trade sanctions, carbon border adjustment mechanisms. 2 examples. So one is the US and the EU are exploring cooperation on steel and aluminum trade. They're very much thinking about how can we prevent Chinese steel and aluminum from entering our markets? How can we protect ourselves? there's this risk that this slides into protectionism, but also that this will increase, of course, cost for primary materials, raw material inputs for windmills, for instance, etc. So politically, I understand why there's thinking about these measures, but there are certainly risks also to the energy transition. The German Chancellor is going to propose something in the upcoming G7 summit in Elmau later this month, in which they think more about an open climate alliance, and they will focus at least also on carrots, not only sticks. We need the sticks, but I really think the focus in cooperation has to also be on carrots. And there's another reason why, in ensuring that countries around the world do have sort of, is that these things are popular. These are politically much more popular, and they sort of create a much more viable political pathway towards eventually also having the sticks, having robust carbon prices at the same levels in other parts of the world. So it's also sort of a political dynamic, a sequencing process. Hence, the message here really is sticks are important. We need them, but we also have to really think about carrots. Let's not forget those, because that's the only durable solution to the spillover challenge. Thank you.
And please have a seat. Okay, lots to think about. I'd like to start with you, Cecilia. I mean, we've heard a lot about cooperation. It all sounds incredibly positive. How optimistic are you that there can be greater global cooperation of the kind we've heard about?
Well, I think we need to be optimistic because there is actually no alternative. But I appreciate your presentation here, and also when you brought up the issue of territorial emissions and consumption-based emissions. And actually, to be honest, we actually have more than 100% difference here as well. We have 4.9 tons per person in territorial and 9 tons of CO2 emissions per person in consumption-based, basically, more or less. The question is, right now, we have the first proposal in the world, as far as I know, to supplement the territorial goals with consumption-based goals. So this is an interesting experiment. And I think that because we are actually measuring the territorial goals, and as far as I know, all the parties are behind this proposal. So it looks like it's going to go through in some way. But the interesting thing is for a government is to what tools should you use to decrease the consumption-based emissions? It means cooperation, to be honest. It also means that you need to put pressure on your suppliers. It also might mean that you need to import less to be more effective and efficient in the materials that you use. So I think there is a smorgasbord of lots of things that you need to do in order to get the consumption-based emissions down. When it comes to CBAM, I think it is like a second-best solution. And I think it might be needed to protect the innovation that we have done here. And I see it as more of an experiment that you might need to go and start somewhere and then maybe to adjust it as you go along. Because as you say, it's really difficult to know what's the outcome of this. Thank you.
Thanks. Some really interesting points there. Magnus, politically speaking, so your party is in opposition at the moment, but what do you see as the way forward? Can you imagine more cooperation? How challenging would that be?
Yes, I can. I'd like to pick up. I hope that it's not just an interesting experiment looking at our consumption-based, the emissions. I hope that this will be the norm in Sweden and more broadly looking forward. CBAM, yeah, okay, sorry, I misunderstood you there. But just saying on that, because I think that one reason why we have such a broad political agreement on the basics there about whether we should supplement our goals with these kind of goals or not, is that we're not just looking at what we import, we're also looking at what we export, and I think that's crucial. And looking at Swedish production, which is we don't want to export more production from Sweden. We can see that we're not really sure. Will we be producing more? We're opening new. We're really expanding our steel industry. We might be hopefully expanding some other parts of our industry, and that's a good thing. So I think that that's the two sides of the same target. I'm not sure that CBAM is even the second best solution. It might be the third or fourth best, but it's what we can achieve. And I didn't tell you this, Maddie, but I'm ideologically a classical liberal. There are parts of this that scares the bejesus out of me. Restricting free trade and really I'm really afraid that we might be imposing new barriers for trade, which personally I think we should be as free as possible. But on the other hand, if we want to become more progressive, if we want to set higher climate standards within the European Union, we have to have some way of managing trade and managing imports to the European Union. And right now, this seems like the manageable way forward. And I'm completely behind that, reservations included. And I think you're completely right that long term, what we want to see is a diffusion of low carbon technology. But that's not where we're at right now. That's not where we're at this point in time. And I think that, I'm sure that I will live to see what comes after CBAM. But I think that this is what we need. This is the best we can achieve right now. And it's crucial that we get something along these lines right now to get us to the next step.
Yeah, Scandinavian art of compromise and consensus.
Might I say two more words? Circular
briefly,
economy.
please.
Because we've talked surprisingly little in the Swedish context about circular economy, and that should be an integral part of our climate change goals, our climate goals. Reducing our demand for virgin materials and raw materials. And I think that's crucial, and we're not where we should be in that aspect today.
Thank you very much. Yes, pass the mic to Sigrid. We'll get some concluding comments from her. Thanks.
I think it's extremely interesting what you talked about, but also very complex. So my reflection is more with the increased political troubles and geopolitical troubles we experience now. What happens, or what do we do when one country say that we have a lot of this rare earth metal, but in order for you to take part of it and have it, you need to do this, that, and that.
Yeah.
So I think that is the complex, not to agree on the emissions or whatever, but to agree on how we should live in total on the globe.
Yeah, and a very relevant question given various threats that have been made recently. Svante, would you like to wrap up with your thoughts?
Yes, I think CBAM has been successful so far because just to talk about it has been effective. So that's a good strategy, I think. We can talk about it a long time because it has a strong impact on all countries today. The other thing I think is most important when we talk about model countries or EU and Sweden, all that, the most important thing is to speed up the learning curve. The most important thing. New technology need to be cheaper. How could it be cheaper? You need to protect some early movers, otherwise they don't invest. Then it will be cheap for all people if we have some protection of the early movers. And then we can export, and every country can now buy very cheap solar panels because we have some countries and some areas in the world was protected. Fossil-free steel needs protection in the beginning. Not so many years. I heard now, some days ago, that I think they can compete even with fossil-free. It could be the same price as fossil steel. So the most important thing for the whole world is to protect the early movers. Otherwise, we have to wait. And then we can spread out new technology very, very fast to all people. So that's why we need protection in some part of our development. The other thing, I think, if we need to reduce the emissions of our consumption pattern, we have to speed up the transformation of an energy system. It's a reflection. Why I have 9 ton. It depends that we have countries that we buy products from, like Germany, China, that have not fossil-free energy system. So it's more interesting to think what in my behavior is not sustainable, even when other countries have 100% renewables. That's the most important thing. But otherwise, these shows and other things will be very fossil-free in the future. Otherwise, we can't reach the Paris Agreement. But, for example, meat production. It's another very more difficult issue, even if other countries has 100% renewables.
Yeah. Lots of challenges and lots of questions stemming from what we've heard today. We haven't got time for audience questions, but do you want to say a final few words, Professor Melling?
No, I'll say one thing, that you're absolutely right. The perhaps the most positive thing the CBAM has done. It's just the announcement and the impact on other countries, whether it's on the southern border of the, Morocco, et cetera, along the Mediterranean, whether it's Asia. There's a lot of sort of momentum to think more about carbon pricing, partly stimulated by the CBAM.
It's a new instrument to talk.
Yeah, and talking's always good. All right, well, thank you very much. Let's say thank you to our final speaker, Professor Melling, also to Magnus Ek, Member of Parliament for the Centre Party, Sigrid Karlsson from KTH University, Svante Axelsson from Fossil Free Sweden, and Dr. Cecilia Hermansson from KTH University. Thank you very much to all of you. And that is unfortunately all we've got time for. I hope you've got a lot out of today's discussions. I've certainly left with a lot of food for thought. Please do send any feedback on today's event to the Swedish Entrepreneurship Forum, and we hope to see you again. Thanks very much.
I think we should just give a big hand to Maddie Savage, our moderator, who managed to guide us through this morning. Thank you, Maddie.
Thank you.